Some wounds never heal, no matter how much time passes. Walt Granger had carried the pain in his back for 20 years, a constant reminder of dreams that had cost him everything. The old cowboy thought it was just another scar from his rodeo days, but when the local doctor finally cut it open, they found something impossible. Buried deep in the tissue was a carved piece of black stone with strange markings. It wasn't from any bull ride. Someone had put it there on purpose. As Walt stared at the ancient artifact, he realized his quiet retirement was about to become something far more dangerous. The stone connected him to disappearances that went back over 100 years. What happens when your past holds secrets you never knew existed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The Nevada sun had already begun its descent behind the distant mountains when Walt Granger pulled his weathered pickup truck into the gravel driveway of his modest ranch. The dust cloud that followed him settled slowly in the evening air, coating the fence posts and mailbox with another layer of the desert's endless gift. At 68, Walt moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed more punishment than it was designed to handle. His knees creaked as he stepped down from the cab, and his back, always his back, sent its familiar spike of pain up his spine. The ranch wasn't much to look at. 15 acres of scrub brush and stubborn grass, a small house that had seen better decades, and a barn that leaned slightly to the east as if it were perpetually braced against the desert wind. But it was his, bought with the last of his prize money from the rodeo circuit, and it represented something he'd never thought he'd have: peace. Walt's fingers unconsciously moved to the championship belt buckle at his waist, a tarnished piece of silver and gold that had once gleamed under arena lights from Cheyenne to San Antonio. The buckle bore the inscription National Finals Rodeo Champion 1987, along with an engraved bronco and rider. It was the only trophy he'd kept from his years on the circuit, the only tangible reminder of the man he'd been when the crowds cheered his name and sponsors fought to put their logos on his gear. Those days felt like someone else's life now. 30 years of 8-second rides, broken bones, and endless miles between dusty towns had taken their toll. Walt had been good, better than good, actually. For nearly a decade, he'd been among the top riders in professional rodeo, earning enough to live well and dream of something more. But the sport that had made him had also broken him, piece by piece, until the pain outweighed the glory, and the young riders started looking at him with a mixture of respect and pity. He'd walked away in 1995, at 58, with a bank account that would let him buy this little piece of Nevada desert and enough left over to live simply. What he hadn't counted on was how quiet retirement would be, how the absence of adrenaline and applause would create a hollow space in his chest that never quite filled. The house smelled like coffee and leather when he stepped inside. Walt had never been one for decoration, and the interior reflected his practical nature. A well-worn couch faced a modest television, flanked by bookcases filled with biographies of cowboys and Western novels. The kitchen was clean and functional, stocked with the essentials a man needed to feed himself without fuss. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a few photographs: Walt on horseback as a young man, his parents at their wedding, and a faded color snapshot of him holding his championship buckle, high above his head in some long-forgotten arena. What the house didn't contain were pictures of a family. Walt had never married, never had children. The rodeo had been his life, his mistress, his everything. He told himself for decades that there would be time for settling down later, after just one more season, one more championship, one more chance at the big purse. By the time he realized that later had passed him by, he was alone with his trophies and his memories. The pain in his back chose that moment to flare, as it did every evening around sunset. Walt grimaced and reached over his shoulder, trying to massage the spot between his shoulder blades where the ache seemed to originate. The wound, if it could even be called that anymore, had been troubling him for 20 years. It had started as what he assumed was a minor injury from a particularly brutal ride in Omaha. A Brahma bull named Tornado Alley had thrown him hard, and Walt had landed awkwardly against the arena fence. At the time, it had seemed like just another bruise to add to his collection, but this one had never quite healed. Over the years, it had developed into a raised, inflamed area about the size of a silver dollar, slightly to the right of his spine. Sometimes it throbbed with a pulse that seemed to match his heartbeat. Other times, it felt like something was moving beneath the skin, shifting and settling like a splinter, working its way deeper into the muscle. Walt had seen doctors over the years, sports medicine specialists who understood the particular ways that rodeo cowboys broke down. They'd taken X-rays and MRs, prescribed anti-inflammatory medications, and physical therapy. The consensus had always been the same: scar tissue from an old injury, nothing that time and careful living wouldn't manage. But the pain had never subsided, and lately it seemed to be getting worse. The worst part was the dreams. They'd started about 5 years ago, vivid nightmares that left him waking in a cold sweat. In them, he was always riding, not in any arena he recognized, but across an endless desert landscape under a blood-red sky. The horse beneath him wasn't a bronco, but something wild and dark, its eyes reflecting a malevolent intelligence. And always, pursuing them across the desert, came a figure in a long black coat, riding a horse that seemed to be made of shadows and smoke. Walt shook his head, trying to dispel the memory of the dreams. At his age, a man's mind could play tricks on him, especially when pain kept him from sleeping soundly. He made himself a simple dinner: steak, potatoes, and green beans, and settled into his routine of evening television. The local news was full of the usual small-town concerns: county budget discussions, high school football scores, and a brief mention of unusual weather patterns that had some of the old-timers talking about omens. As the news ended and gave way to a Western movie he'd seen a dozen times, Walt found his thoughts drifting to Dr. Maynard. Samuel Maynard had been the town's primary physician for over 30 years, and in the last decade, he'd become something like a friend to Walt. They were roughly the same age, both men who dedicated their lives to demanding professions and found themselves alone in their later years. Maynard had been after Walt for months to let him take another look at the persistent wound on his back, and maybe it was time to listen. The doctor's office was located in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its white clapboard siding and green shutters giving it the appearance of a country home rather than a medical facility. Maynard had bought the building when he'd first come to town, fresh out of medical school and full of ambitions to serve rural communities that larger hospitals ignored. Over the decades, he delivered babies, set bones, and held the hands of dying patients, becoming as much a part of the town's fabric as the courthouse or the old church. Walt respected the man's dedication and skill, but more than that, he appreciated Maynard's straightforward manner. The doctor didn't talk down to his patients or dismiss their concerns with medical jargon. When Walt described the persistent ache in his back, Maynard listened with the attention of someone who understood that pain was more than just nerve signals. It was a thief that stole sleep, peace of mind, and the simple pleasure of moving through the world without constant reminders of mortality. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the empty land. Walt finished his dinner and prepared for bed, but he knew sleep would be elusive. The pain in his back seemed more insistent tonight, throbbing with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if something were trying to communicate through the inflamed tissue. As he lay in the darkness, Walt found himself thinking about legacy. He'd spent his life chasing 8-second rides and championship buckles, measuring success by the applause of strangers and the weight of prize money in his pocket. But what did any of that matter now? Who would remember Walt Granger in 50 years, or even 10? He had no children to carry his name, no wife to share his memories, no lasting contribution to the world beyond a few faded newspaper clippings and a trophy case gathering dust. The thought troubled him more than the pain in his back. A man ought to leave something behind, some mark that he'd been here and mattered. Walt had always assumed there would be time to figure out what that something might be. Now, approaching 70 with his best years behind him, he wondered if he'd waited too long. The wind continued to howl outside, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack, the yes. Sound lonely and wild and achingly familiar. Walt closed his eyes and tried to find sleep, but the pain in his back pulsed like a second heartbeat, keeping him awake and reminding him that some wounds never truly heal. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call Dr. Maynard and make that appointment. After 20 years of living with the mysterious ache, it was time to find out once and for all what was wrong with him. He had no way of knowing that this simple decision would set in motion events that would transform his quiet retirement into something far more dangerous and meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. Dr. Samuel Maynard's office smelled of antiseptic and old leather, a combination that Walt had grown familiar with over the years. The examination room hadn't changed much since his last visit. The same faded motivational posters on the walls, the same crackling paper on the examination table, the same sense of quiet competence that had made Maynard the most trusted doctor in 3 counties. "Walt, I'm glad you finally decided to let me take a proper look at this thing," Maynard said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the inflamed area on Walt's back. The doctor was a lean man in his mid-60s, with silver hair and gentle hands that had delivered more babies and mended more bones than he cared to count. "How long did you say it's been bothering you?" 20 years, give or take." Walt sat on the edge of the examination table, his shirt draped over a nearby chair. "Started after a bad ride in Omaha. Bull named Tornado Alley threw me into the fence. Pretty hard." Maynard nodded, making notes on Walt's chart. "And you said the pain has been getting worse lately?" "Every night around sunset, like clockwork. Sometimes it feels like something's moving under the skin." Walt paused, feeling foolish for admitting it. "I know how that sounds." "It doesn't sound foolish at all," Maynard assured him. "The body has ways of telling us when something isn't right. Let me take a closer look." The doctor's examination was thorough and gentle, his experienced fingers probing the edges of the inflamed area. Walt winced as Maynard pressed against the center of the wound, where the skin was raised and discolored. "There's definitely something foreign in there," Maynard said after several minutes of careful palpation. "I can feel it hard, irregular shape, maybe an inch across. Could be bone fragments from the original injury, or possibly some debris that got embedded when you hit that fence." Walt twisted his head, trying to see over his shoulder. "Can you get it out?" "I think so, but I'll need to make an incision. It's a minor surgical procedure, local anesthetic. Clean it out, stitch you up. You'll be uncomfortable for a few days, but if this is what's been causing your pain, removing it should give you significant relief." The decision was easy. Walt had lived with the persistent ache long enough. Let's do it. Maynard prepared for the procedure with the methodical care of a man who'd performed thousands of minor surgeries. He numbed the area with lidocaine, arranged his instruments on a sterile tray, and positioned a bright lamp to illuminate the surgical site. Walt lay face down on the examination table, trying to relax as the local anesthetic took effect. "You won't feel any pain," Maynard explained, "but you might feel some pressure and tugging. Try to stay as still as possible." The incision was precise, following the natural lines of the inflamed tissue. Walt felt the pressure the doctor had warned him about, along with an odd sensation of release, as if something that had been trapped for decades was finally being freed. Maynard worked quietly, using small retractors to open the wound and explore the tissue beneath. "Well, I'll be damned," the doctor muttered after a few minutes. "What is it?" Walt asked, his voice slightly muffled by the examination table. "This isn't what I expected." Maynard's voice carried a note of confusion that Walt had never heard before. "Walt, this isn't bone or debris from your accident. Give me a moment." Walt heard the soft clink of metal instruments and the rustle of gauze. The pressure in his back shifted as Maynard worked to extract whatever he'd found. Then came a sound Walt couldn't identify, something like glass scraping against metal, followed by a sharp intake of breath from the doctor. "Samuel, what is it?" I'm not sure." Maynard's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Walt, I need you to stay very still while I clean this up and close the incision. We'll talk about what I found in just a moment." The remainder of the procedure passed in tense silence. Walt felt the familiar tug of sutures being placed, the application of antibiotic ointment, and the gentle pressure of bandages being secured. Throughout it all, his mind raced with questions about what could have caused such an unusual reaction from a man who'd seen everything the human body could produce. "All right, you can sit up now," Maynard said finally, stripping off his surgical gloves. "Take your time." Walt eased himself upright, conscious of the fresh stitches pulling at his skin. Maynard had moved to the small sink in the corner, where he was carefully washing something in a metal bowl. When he turned back to face Walt, his expression was graved out. In his palm lay a piece of black stone, roughly triangular in shape and about the size of a silver dollar. Its surface was polished to a mere finish, and etched into its face were symbols that looked like no writing system Walt had ever seen. The markings seemed to shift and flow in the fluorescent light, creating an optical illusion that made Walt's eyes water. "This was embedded in the muscle tissue just below your shoulder blade," Maynard said, holding the stone up to the light. "It's obsidian volcanic glass. But Walt, this wasn't put there by any accident. Someone carved these symbols by hand, and they're old. Very old." Walt stared at the artifact, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "That's impossible. I've never seen anything like that in my life. How could it have gotten there? I wish I could tell you." Maynard set the stone on the examination table between them, and both men found themselves staring at it. The tissue around it had grown in a very specific pattern, almost like your body was trying to isolate it. But here's the thing that really bothers me. There was no scar tissue, no signs of trauma or forced entry. It's as if this stone had always been part of you. The symbols on the obsidian seemed to pulse in Walt's peripheral vision, and he found himself remembering fragments of his recurring dreams, the endless desert, the dark rider pursuing him across the wasteland. "Samuel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Maynard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the examination table. "Not exactly like this. No. But—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "Walt, my father was the town doctor before me. When he passed away 10 years ago, I inherited his files, his equipment, and some personal items he'd kept in his office safe." The doctor moved to an old oak cabinet and withdrew a weathered leather pouch, its surface darkened with age. This was among his things. Along with a journal entry dated 1962, he wrote about treating a patient who'd come to him with symptoms very similar to yours: persistent pain, strange dreams, and something embedded under the skin. Walt's pulse quickened as Maynard opened the pouch and revealed its contents: dried herbs, small animal bones, and a collection of items that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a medical office. At the bottom of the pouch was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "What does it say?" Walt asked. Maynard unfolded the paper and read aloud in a voice barely above a whisper. Patient reported recurring nightmares of a dark rider and complained of object moving beneath skin. Surgical removal revealed carved obsidian stone with markings similar to those described in Paiute legends of the cursed stone of the Shadow Rider. Patient died 3 days after removal, cause unknown. Note: must research connection to local disappearances. The curse may be real. The examination room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Walt felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of the journal entry sank in. "Your patient died after the stone was removed?" he asked. "According to my father's notes, yes." Maynard's expression was grave. "Walt, I think we're dealing with something that goes far beyond conventional medicine. These symbols, this stone, they're connected to something much older than your rodeo accident." Walt picked up the obsidian artifact, surprised by how warm it felt in his palm. The moment his skin made contact with the polished surface, images flashed through his mind, brief, terrifying glimpses of figures in old-fashioned clothing, a man in a black coat riding across the desert, and symbols carved into stone under a moonless sky. "Samuel," he said quietly, "I think we need to find out what happened to those missing people your father mentioned. And we need to find out fast." Outside, the Nevada sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of blood. Neither man spoke, but both understood that Walt's quiet retirement had just come to an end. The Millfield County Historical Society occupied a cramped storefront between a hardware store and a diner that served the best pie in 3 counties. Walt had driven past the building hundreds of times over the years, but had never had reason to step inside. Now, with the obsidian stone wrapped carefully in his shirt pocket and Dr. Maynard beside him, the modest archive felt like their best hope for answers. Margaret Whitfield had been the Historical Society's volunteer librarian for 37 years. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who knew more about local history than the official county records. When Walt and Dr. Maynard explained what they were looking for, information about disappearances dating back to the 1870s and anything related to carved stones or Native American legends, her demeanor shifted from polite interest to intense focus. "You're talking about the Blackthorn incidents," she said without hesitation, leading them toward a section of filing cabinets that looked older than the building itself. "Most folks around here have forgotten about Ezra Blackthorn, but my grandmother used to tell stories about him when I was little. Said he was the devil himself, riding across the desert and stealing people away in the night." She pulled out a thick folder marked "Unsolved Cases, 1870s," and spread its contents across a reading table. The documents were a mixture of handwritten reports, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be official correspondence between the local sheriff and territorial authorities. "Started in the spring of 1874, Margaret continued, pointing to the oldest documents. "People began disappearing from isolated farms and ranches, always at night, always without a trace. No signs of struggle, no tracks, nothing left behind, except sometimes strange markings carved into fence posts or barn doors." Walt leaned forward to examine a faded newspaper clipping from the Millfield Gazette, dated June 15, 1874. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague County. 5th. Family vanishes without trace." The article described the disappearance of the Henderson family, a rancher, his wife, and their 2 children from their homestead 15 miles south of town. "The authorities blamed it on Indian raids at first," Margaret explained, "but the local tribes insisted they had nothing to do with it. That's when Ezra Blackthorn's name started coming up." She produced another document, this one bearing an official seal and dated August 3, 1874. It was a report from Sheriff William Cade to the territorial governor, describing Blackthorn as a man of unknown origin who's been seen in the vicinity of each disappearance. riding a black horse and carrying what witnesses describe as bags of carved stones. Dr. Maynard looked up from the documents he'd been studying. Carved stones? Margaret, do you have any more specific descriptions of these stones? As a matter of fact, I do. Margaret disappeared into the stacks and returned with a leather-bound photograph album. These are daguerreotypes taken by a traveling photographer who came through town in September of 1874. He was documenting the settlements for some Eastern newspaper. She opened the album to reveal a collection of sepia-toned photographs showing the town's early residents, their faces solemn and their clothing formal despite the harsh desert environment. Most of the images were standard portraits of families and business owners, but one photograph made Walt's blood run cold. The daguerreotype showed a group of settlers standing in front of what appeared to be a general store. In the foreground, a dozen men, women, and children posed stiffly for the camera, their expressions reflecting the serious nature of early photography. But in the background, partially obscured by shadows and the primitive focus of the camera, stood a solitary figure. The man wore a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something wrong with his posture, something inhuman about the way he stood. And in his left hand, clearly visible despite the photograph's age and fading, was a bag that seemed to bulge with irregular shapes. "That's him," Margaret said quietly. "Ezra Blackthorne. This is the only known photograph of him, and it was taken just days before the final disappearance, the one that finally drove him out of the county." Walt pulled the obsidian stone from his pocket and placed it on the table beside the photograph. In the dim light of the Historical Society, the carved symbols seemed to writhe and shift, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Margaret," Dr. Maynard said carefully, "have you ever seen markings like these before?" The elderly librarian studied the stone for several long minutes, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Not exactly like these, no. But my grandmother used to draw similar symbols when she told her stories about Blackthorne. She claimed they were cursed mark signs that the Shadow Rider used to mark his victims." "Shadow Rider?" Walt asked. "That's what the local Paiute called him." According to their oral traditions, Blackthorne wasn't entirely human. They said he was possessed by something ancient and evil, something that had been sleeping beneath the desert until he woken up by desecrating their sacred burial grounds. Walt felt a familiar chill as memories of his recurring dreams surfaced. The endless desert landscape, the dark figure pursuing him, the sense of ancient malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very sand and stone. What happened to him? How did they stop him? Margaret closed the photograph album and returned it to its place on the shelf. According to the official records, Sheriff Cade organized a posse in October of 1874. They tracked Blackthorne to a canyon about 20 miles north of here and cornered him near some old Indian ruins. There was a gunfight, and Blackthorne was killed. "But you don't think that's the whole story?" Dr. Maynard observed, double quotes. "No, I don't." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "My grandmother always insisted that Blackthorne didn't die that day. She said the posse found his horse and his coat, but his body was never recovered. And the disappearances didn't stop. They just became less frequent, more spread out over time." Walt's hands trembled slightly as he rewrapped the obsidian stone. "What do you mean, more spread out?" "Every 20 or 30 years, someone would vanish under circumstances that reminded the old-timers of the Blackthorne incidents. Always isolated individuals, always without explanation. The last one I can document was in 1943, a drifter named Jackson, who was working on the Rocking M Ranch, found his belongings scattered across the desert, but never found him. As they prepared to leave the Historical Society, Margaret pressed a manila folder into Walt's hands. "These are copies of everything I could find about the Blackthorne case. including some genealogical records that might interest you. I did a little research after you called this morning." Walt opened the folder and found himself staring at a family tree that traced his lineage back to the 1870s. Near the top of the chart, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, was a name that made his heart skip. Thomas Granger. Disappeared. October 12, 1874. Presumed victim of Ezra Blackthorne. "Your great-great-grandfather," Margaret explained gently. "One of the last people to disappear before the posse went after Blackthorne. Walt, I think this stone of yours isn't just connected to the old legends. I think it's connected to your family." Outside, the desert wind had picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the empty streets. Walt clutched the folder containing his family's dark history and wondered what other secrets were buried in his bloodline. As they walked back to Dr. Maynard's truck, neither man noticed the shadows that seemed to follow them, or the way the late afternoon sun cast their silhouettes in shapes that didn't quite match their bodies. Walt spread the genealogical documents across his kitchen table, the overhead light casting harsh shadows on the faded papers. Dr. Maynard sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold while they pored over Margaret's research. The obsidian stone lay between them, its dark surface seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Thomas Granger, Walt read aloud from the family tree. Born 1841, married to Sarah Mitchell in 1863. 2 children: Samuel, born 1864, and Mary, born 1867. He traced his finger down the genealogical chart. "Samuel was my great-grandfather. He would have been just 10 years old when his father disappeared." "Doctor." Maynard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That explains how the bloodline continued. The children survived whatever happened to Thomas." Walt turned to another document in Margaret's collection, a yellowed piece of paper that appeared to be a wanted poster. The text was partially faded, but the illustration was clear enough. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile, wearing the same long coat they'd seen in the daguerreotype. "Ezra Blackthorne," Walt read. "Wanted for murder, robbery, and desecration of sacred grounds. Last seen October 1874. Reward, $500 dead or alive." Below the illustration was a list of crimes that made Walt's stomach turn. Says here, he was suspected of killing at least 15 people between Colorado and Nevada, always taking something from each victim as a trophy. Taking something? Dr. Maynard asked. Walt read further down the poster. "Personal effects, jewelry, sometimes." He paused, his face growing pale. "Sometimes pieces of the victims themselves. Hair, teeth, small bones." The authorities thought he was making some kind of ritual objects. The wind outside had intensified, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds bouncing across Walt's property. As if summoned by their conversation about the past, the desert seemed to be growing restless, eager to share its buried secrets. Dr. Maynard pulled out his father's journal from his medical bag and flipped to a page he'd marked earlier. "Walt, listen to this entry from 1962. Patient reported family stories about ancestor who encountered the Shadow Rider in 1874. Said the man in black performed some kind of ritual before killing his great-grandfather, placing carved stones on the body while speaking in an unknown language. Family believes this created a blood curse that would follow the bloodline until the debt was paid." "Debt?" Walt asked. "What kind of debt?" "I'm not sure, but there's more." Maynard turned the page. "My father wrote that the patient claimed Blackthorne wasn't working alone. He was serving something, an entity that the local Paiute tribes had imprisoned beneath the desert centuries before white settlers arrived. Blackthorne's desecration of their burial grounds had weakened the spiritual barriers keeping this thing trapped." Walt felt the familiar chill that had been haunting him since the stone was removed from his back. "So you're saying this isn't just about some crazy outlaw from the 1870s? "Yes, you're talking about something supernatural." I'm talking about something that my father, a rational, scientific man, took seriously enough to keep detailed records about. Dr. Maynard closed the journal and met Walt's eyes. And something that's been marking your family for over a century. As if responding to their conversation, the obsidian stone on the table began to emit a faint humming sound, so low it was felt more than heard. Both men stared at it, watching as the carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Walt reached out tentatively and touched the stone's surface. The moment his skin made contact, the world around him shifted. The kitchen disappeared, replaced by a vision of the Nevada desert as it had existed 150 years ago. He saw Thomas Granger, a man who shared Walt's strong jaw and determined eyes, riding across the wasteland on a sturdy horse, unaware that something was stalking him from the shadows. The vision shifted, showing Blackthorn emerging from behind, a cluster of red rocks, his face now visible beneath the wide-brimmed hat. It wasn't entirely human. The features were too sharp, the eyes too deep, and when he smiled, his teeth were filed to points like those of a predator. Walt watched in horror as his ancestor was dragged from his horse and forced to kneel beside a pile of carved stones. Blackthorn spoke in a language that sounded like wind through dead trees, placing one of the obsidian artifacts against Thomas's back while pressing his other hand to the man's forehead. The stone seemed to melt into Thomas's flesh, disappearing beneath the skin while the man screamed in agony. "Walt!" Dr. Maynard's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Walt, let go of the stone." Walt yanked his hand back, the vision shattering like glass. He was back in his kitchen, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. Dr. Maynard was gripping his shoulders, his face etched with concern. "What did you see?" the doctor asked. "My ancestor." "Thomas." Walt wiped sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. Blackthorn put the stone in him while he was still alive. It wasn't just murder. It was some kind of ritual. Dr. Maynard helped Walt to his feet and guided him to the living room, away from the cursed artifact. "We need help, Walt. This is beyond anything I learned in medical school, and it's certainly beyond what we can handle on our own." "What kind of help?" "The kind that understands the spiritual traditions of this land." If Blackthorn was interfering with Paiute burial grounds and awakening something that should have stayed buried, then maybe the Paiute know how to put it back to sleep. Walt nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the vision. "How do we find someone like that?" "The same way we found Margaret, we ask around. There's a Paiute reservation about 50 miles north of here. Someone there might be willing to listen to our story." As they prepared to leave the house, Walt took one last look at the obsidian stone on his kitchen table. The symbols had stopped glowing, but the artifact still radiated a sense of malevolent purpose, whatever Ezra Blackthorn had started over. A century ago, it wasn't finished yet. Outside, the desert wind continued to howl, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the whispered promises of secrets yet to be revealed. Walt locked his door and followed Dr. Maynard to the truck, unaware that shadows were already gathering around his property, and that something ancient was stirring beneath the Nevada sand, awakening to the fact that its long-dormant plan was finally nearing completion. The drive north to the Paiute Reservation took Walt and Dr. Maynard through some of the most desolate country in Nevada. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Red rock formations jutting from sandy flats, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the harsh environment, and a sky so vast it seemed to dwarf human concerns. Walt kept the obsidian stone wrapped in a cloth on the seat between them, conscious of its weight even though it couldn't have been more than a few ounces. According to Dr. Maynard's GPS, they were looking for a location that had once been a sacred burial ground, somewhere in the desert between the reservation and Walt's ranch. Margaret's research had indicated that the site was marked by a natural spring and a collection of red sandstone formations that the Paiute called the fingers of the earth spirits. They found it just after noon, when the sun was at its harshest and the desert shimmered with heat waves. The spring was little more than a seep that created a small oasis of grass and desert willows. But the stone formations were unmistakable. 5 towering pillars of red rock that rose from the desert floor like the fingers of a giant's hand. What they discovered at the site made both men fall silent with respect and horror. The sacred burial ground had been systematically destroyed. Ancient stone cairns that had once marked graves lay scattered and broken. Petroglyphs carved into the rock faces had been defaced with crude tools, their spiritual significance obliterated by someone who either didn't understand or didn't care about their meaning. Most disturbing of all were the circular patterns of blackened earth where fires had been built, each one surrounded by symbols that matched those on Walt's obsidian stone. "This is what Blackthorn did," Dr. Maynard said quietly, kneeling beside one of the desecrated grave markers. "This is how he woke up whatever was sleeping here." Walt felt the familiar pain in his back flare as he approached one of the burned circles. The moment he stepped within the blackened perimeter, visions began flooding his mind, not the clear, focused images he'd experienced when touching the stone, but fragmented glimpses of rituals conducted under starless skies. He saw Blackthorn, kneeling at the center of similar circles, carving symbols into pieces of obsidian while speaking in that inhuman language. He saw bodies victims from the 1874 disappearances arranged around the perimeter of the ritual sites, each one bearing a carved stone pressed into their flesh. And he saw something rising from beneath the desert floor in response to these offerings, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to break the spiritual barriers that held it prisoner. "Walt," Dr. Maynard's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to step out of that circle." Walt stumbled backward, the visions fading as he left the blackened earth. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were shaking. "It's still here," he gasped. "Whatever Blackthorn awakened, it's still here, waiting." They were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A battered pickup truck emerged from behind one of the stone formations, kicking up a plume of dust as it approached. The driver was a man in his 60s with long gray hair and weathered features that spoke of a lifetime spent under the desert sun. He wore jeans, boots, and a faded shirt that had seen better decades. But there was something in his bearing that commanded immediate respect. "You gentlemen lost?" the man asked as he stepped out of his truck. His voice carried no hostility, but there was a wariness in his eyes as he looked at the desecrated burial ground. "We're looking for someone who might be able to help us understand what happened here," Dr. Maynard replied. "My name is Samuel Maynard, and this is Walt Granger. We found something that we think might be connected to this site." The man studied them for a long moment before nodding. "I'm Thomas Red Cloud. This was a sacred place for my people. Has been for more generations than the white man has been in this desert." He gestured toward the broken cans and defaced petroglyphs. "Someone did this more than 100 years ago, but the damage goes deeper than what you can see." Walt pulled the wrapped obsidian stone from his pocket. "Would this have anything to do with the damage?" Thomas Red Cloud's entire demeanor changed. When he saw the artifact, his eyes widened with what might have been fear, and he took an involuntary step backward. "Where did you get that?" "It was embedded in my back," Walt explained. "The doctor here removed it yesterday, and we've been trying to understand what it is ever since." Thomas approached slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "May I see it more closely?" "I won't touch it, but I need to see the markings." Walt unwrapped the stone and held it out at arm's length. Thomas studied the carved symbols with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient text, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "These are binding marks," he said finally, "used in the old ways to tie a spirit to the physical world. Someone carved these to create a connection between your bloodline and something that should never have been awakened. What kind of something? Dr. Maynard asked. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between the obsidian stone and the desecrated burial ground. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of ancestral memory. My grandfather told stories about a shadow that lived beneath the desert, something that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each soul it claimed. Our ancestors built this burial ground to keep it trapped, using the spiritual energy of the dead to maintain barriers that held it prisoner. But someone, this blackthorn you mentioned, broke those barriers. Walt felt his legs growing weak. And the stone? The stone marks you as belonging to it. As long as you carry that mark, you're connected to the shadow. It can find you anywhere, influence your dreams, and eventually claim you as it claimed. Your ancestor. The desert around them seemed to grow quieter, as if even the wind was holding its breath. In the distance, Walt could see dust devils spinning across the empty land, but they moved in patterns that didn't match the natural flow of the wind. There has to be a way to break the connection, Dr. Maynard said. Thomas nodded slowly. There is, but it requires great courage and even greater sacrifice. The shadow must be returned to its prison, and the spiritual barriers must be rebuilt. It's not something that can be done lightly or without cost. As if responding to their conversation, the obsidian stone in Walt's hand began to pulse with that familiar internal light. The symbols carved into its surface writhed and shifted, and somewhere in the distance, Walt could swear he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching across the desert sand. Thomas Red Cloud's home was a modest adobe structure built in the traditional style, its thick walls providing cool refuge from the desert heat. Inside, the rooms were filled with the tools and artifacts of a man who served as keeper of his peoples. Spiritual traditions. Bundles of sage and sweetgrass hung from the ceiling beams, their earthy scent filling the air with a sense of ancient wisdom. Shelves lined the walls, holding books on Native American history alongside handmade pottery, carved ceremonial objects, and photographs of tribal elders from generations past. Walt sat at a worn wooden table, the obsidian stone carefully wrapped and placed at a safe distance. Dr. Maynard occupied a chair nearby, his medical bag forgotten as he listened to Thomas explain the spiritual significance of what they were dealing with. The Paiute elder had been preparing for the ritual cleansing ceremony since they'd arrived at his home 3 hours earlier, gathering materials and consulting texts that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. The shadow entity. Your people call evil, Thomas said, crushing dried herbs in a stone bowl. We know by a different name. In our language, it is Kanu'av, the hunger that walks. It existed long before the first humans came to this desert, feeding on the life force of plants and animals, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. He added sweetgrass to the mixture, the smoke rising in complex patterns that seemed to form symbols in the air before dissipating. My ancestors recognized the danger and used their most powerful magic to trap Kanu'av beneath the earth. The burial ground you found wasn't just a place to honor the dead. It was a spiritual prison, with each grave marker serving as a lock on the cage. Walt's back had been aching increasingly as the day wore on, and now the pain was becoming unbearable. How many people has this thing killed over the years? More than you might think, Thomas replied gravely. After Blackthorn broke the barriers, Kanu'av gained enough strength to influence people from a distance. It couldn't fully manifest in the physical world, but it could whisper to those who carried its mark, driving them to violence or despair. Some of the disappearances and mysterious deaths in your county over the past century weren't random. They were the shadow feeding, one soul at a time. Dr. Maynard leaned forward in his chair. Thomas, Walt mentioned that your father treated a patient with similar symptoms in 1962. What happened to that person? Thomas's expression darkened. My father was the tribal medicine man then. He tried to help the marked one, But the ritual went wrong. The man died, and Kanuev grew stronger from his death. That's when my father realized the entity had learned to adapt, to turn our own ceremonies against us. Walt felt a chill despite the warmth of the adobe walls. So there's no way to save someone who's been marked? There is one way, Thomas said, completing his preparation of the sacred bundle. But it requires the marked one to enter the shadows. Domain willingly, to face Kanuev directly and offer himself as bait while the barriers are rebuilt. It's the only way to ensure the entity returns to its prison. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of sage in the ceremonial bowl. Walt stared at the wrapped obsidian stone, understanding what Thomas was telling him. Any chance of breaking the curse would require him to risk everything, probably including his life. What exactly would I have to do? Walt asked quietly. Thomas rose and moved to a cabinet carved from red cedar, removing items that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a home. There was a knife with an obsidian blade, its handle wrapped in leather and decorated with feathers and small bones. Beside it lay a circular arrangement of stones, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the firelight. The ritual must be performed at the original burial ground during the dark of the moon, Thomas explained. You would enter a sacred circle, a medicine wheel, that I will create using these blessed stones. Once inside, you become bait for Kanuev, drawing it into the physical world where it can be trapped. Dr. Maynard stood up abruptly. That sounds like suicide. You're asking Walt to offer himself to this thing. I'm asking him to trust in powers older than written history, Thomas replied calmly. The medicine wheel will provide protection, but only if Walt remains completely within its boundaries. The moment he steps outside the circle, Kanuev can claim him. Walt examined the ceremonial knife, noting how the obsidian blade seemed to absorb light just like the stone that had been embedded in his back. And if the ritual works, if we manage to trap this shadow thing, then the curse on your bloodline ends. The entity returns to its prison, and the spiritual balance of the desert is restored. Thomas paused, meeting Walt's eyes. But understand, Walt, this isn't just about you anymore. Kanuev has been feeding for over a century, growing stronger with each soul it claims. If we don't act soon, it will become powerful enough to break free entirely. When that happens, the disappearances will become massacres. As if summoned by their discussion of its power, supernatural phenomena began manifesting around Thomas's home. The temperature dropped suddenly, sending visible breath misting from their mouths despite the afternoon heat. Electronics began malfunctioning Thomas's. Radio filled with static, the lights flickered, and Walt's watch stopped running. Outside, they could hear the sound of animals fleeing, coyotes howling in distress, birds taking flight in great clouds that darkened the sky. Walt reached toward the wrapped obsidian stone and immediately jerked his hand back. Even through the cloth, the artifact was burning hot to the touch, and the symbols carved into its surface were glowing with an internal fire that cast eerie shadows on the adobe walls. It knows we're planning to stop it, Thomas said, quickly gathering his ritual materials. Kanuev is trying to prevent the ceremony by manifesting its power early. We need to get you away from populated areas before it grows strong enough to harm innocent people. Dr. Maynard grabbed his medical bag. Where can we go? My grandfather's old cabin in the mountains. It's protected by wards that have held for 3 generations. Thomas began packing his ceremonial items into a leather satchel. We'll wait there until the new moon, then return to the burial ground for the final confrontation. As they prepared to leave, Walt took one last look around the peaceful adobe home, wondering if he would live to see another sunrise. Outside, the desert was growing dark despite the early hour, and in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, hoofbeats that belonged to no earthly horse. The mountain cabin stood in a grove of ancient pines, their massive trunks scarred by lightning and weathered by countless seasons. Thomas's grandfather had built the structure more than 80 years ago, choosing this remote location not just for its isolation, but for its spiritual significance. The clearing was surrounded by a ring of standing stones, each one carved with protective symbols that predated European settlement by centuries. Walt spent the first day at the cabin recovering from the supernatural assault that had forced them to flee Thomas's home. The obsidian stone, now secured in a special pouch blessed with sage and cedar, continued to pulse with malevolent energy, but the protective wards around the cabin kept its influence at bay. Dr. Maynard busied himself studying Thomas's collection of tribal medical texts, fascinated by healing traditions that complemented rather than competed with Western medicine. It was on the second evening, as they sat around a small fire discussing the upcoming ritual, that Thomas made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about Ezra Blackthorne and the shadow entity. "I've been thinking about your ancestor's disappearance," Thomas said, consulting a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his great-grandfather. "The timing troubles me. According to your genealogy, Thomas Granger disappeared on October 12, 1874. But according to tribal records, that's the same night the shadow entity was supposedly defeated." Walt looked up from the fire, where he'd been trying to distract himself from the persistent ache in his back. "What do you mean, supposedly defeated?" "The official story says that Sheriff Cade's posse cornered Blackthorne in the canyon and killed him in a gunfight. But my great-grandfather was there that night as a tracker for the posse, and his journal tells a different story." Thomas opened the journal to a page marked with a piece of red ribbon. The writing was faded but legible, a mixture of English and Paiute symbols that told a story far more complex than the one recorded in the territorial archives. According to this account, the posse did find Blackthorne in the canyon, but he wasn't alone. Your ancestor Thomas was there too, along with the bodies of other missing people. They were arranged in a ritual circle around an opening in the canyon floor, a cave that led deep into the earth. Dr. Maynard set down his medical texts. "What kind of ritual?" "One designed to release Kanuav from its prison permanently." Blackthorne had spent months gathering victims, using their life force to weaken the spiritual barriers that held the entity captive. The final ritual required a willing sacrifice, someone who would take the shadow's mark voluntarily and serve as a permanent anchor in the physical world. Walt felt his blood turn cold. "You're saying Thomas volunteered?" "Not exactly." Thomas turned the page, revealing a detailed drawing of the canyon ritual site. "According to my great-grandfather, Thomas had been hunting Blackthorne for weeks, trying to rescue the other victims. When he arrived at the canyon, he found the outlaw performing the final ceremony. Thomas tried to stop him, but he was too late. Kanuav was already beginning to manifest." The drawing showed a scene from Nightmare. Bodies lay arranged in a perfect circle around a gaping hole in the earth, while a figure in a long black coat knelt at the center of the formation. But the figure wasn't entirely human anymore. Something dark and writhing seemed to be emerging from within Blackthorne's body, transforming him into a conduit for the shadow entity. "What happened next changed everything," Thomas continued. Thomas realized he couldn't stop the ritual, so he did the only thing he could, He tackled Blackthorne just as Kanuav was about to complete its emergence, breaking the ceremonial circle and trapping both men in a spiritual feedback loop. Walt studied the journal drawings more closely. So Thomas wasn't a victim. He was trying to be a hero. More than that, he succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Thomas pointed to another drawing that showed two figures falling into the earth opening, surrounded by swirling shadows. Both Thomas and Blackthorne were pulled into Kanuav's domain, but the disrupted ritual created a unique situation. Instead of being fully released, the shadow entity was trapped between worlds, anchored to the physical realm through both men's spiritual essence. Dr. Maynard leaned forward, his scientific mind grappling with the supernatural concepts. "You're saying they're all still down there? Thomas, Blackthorn, and this shadow thing?" "In a manner of speaking, yes. Cowboy exists in a state between life and death, using Blackthorn as its primary host, while Thomas serves as an unwilling anchor. The obsidian stones aren't just marks of ownership. They're pieces of the spiritual chain that binds the entity to our world." Walt pulled out the wrapped stone, feeling its warmth even through the blessed cloth. "Then breaking the curse isn't about destroying the shadow. It's about freeing my ancestor." "Exactly. Thomas has been fighting Cowboy for over a century, preventing it from gaining full control while suffering unimaginable torment. The pain you feel, the visions, the nightmares, they're echoes of his struggle. Every member of your bloodline who's died mysteriously over the years weakened his ability to contain the entity." The implications hit Walt like a physical blow. His ancestor wasn't just a victim of some long-ago tragedy. He was still alive, still fighting, still sacrificing himself to protect the world from an ancient evil. And Walt was the key to either saving him or damning them all. Thomas closed the journal and looked directly at Walt. "This changes the ritual completely. We're not just trapping Kanuav, we're staging a rescue mission. You'll need to enter the Shadow's domain not as bait, but as a replacement. The entity can't exist in our world without an anchor from Thomas's bloodline. If you take his place willingly, he can finally rest, and Kanuav will lose its connection to the physical realm." "What happens to Walt if he does that?" Dr. Maynard asked, his voice tight with concern. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know. The ritual has never been attempted before. You might be able to return once the entity is banished, or you might be trapped like Thomas was. There's no way to know for certain." Walt stood up and walked to the edge of the protective circle, looking out at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, Kanuav was growing stronger, feeding on the fear and chaos it had created. And somewhere in the space between worlds, his ancestor continued a battle that had lasted more than a century. "There's something else," Thomas said softly. "The reason Kanuav chose your bloodline specifically. According to the journal, Thomas wasn't just a random victim. He was descended from medicine people individuals with the spiritual strength to serve as anchors between worlds. The shadow entity didn't just want to escape its prison. It wanted to ensure it could never be trapped again." Walt turned back to face the fire, his decision already made. "Where's the next new moon?" 3 days, Thomas replied. "Then we have 3 days to prepare." Walt sat back down beside the fire, his expression resolute. "Whatever happens, I won't let Thomas suffer any longer. And I won't let that thing loose on the world." Outside the protective circle, the wind began to howl through the pine trees, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder and the promise of storms to come. In his leather satchel, Thomas began gathering the materials for a ritual unlike any that had been performed in over a century, one that would determine whether an ancient evil remained imprisoned or whether it would finally claim dominion over the desert and everything that lived there. The final 3 days at the mountain cabin passed with the deliberate pace of a funeral procession. Walt found himself caught between anticipation and dread, knowing that everything in his life had been leading to this moment, yet terrified of what it might cost him. Thomas spent most of his time in preparation, crafting the sacred obsidian blade that would serve as the focal point for the ritual and consulting with tribal elders through encrypted satellite phone calls that lasted deep into the night. Dr. Maynard had initially objected to the plan, his medical training rebelling against any procedure that might result in his patient's death. But as the supernatural phenomena around them intensified, electronics failing without explanation, animals fleeing the area in visible panic, and temperature fluctuations that defied natural law, he came to understand that conventional medicine had no answers for what they were facing. "Walt," he said on the morning of the new moon, as they prepared to descend from the mountain sanctuary, "I want you to know that in 40 years of practicing medicine, I've never met anyone with more courage than what you're showing today." Walt was sitting on the cabin's front porch, writing what might be his final letters to the handful of people who mattered in his life. His penmanship was careful and deliberate, the words chosen with the precision of a man who understood their weight. "Samuel," he replied without looking up from his writing, "I'm not being courageous. I'm being selfish. I've lived 68 years without making any real difference in the world. My ancestor has been suffering for over a century because of something I'm connected to. This might be the first truly meaningful thing I've ever done." The letter he was writing was addressed to his nephew in Colorado, the son of a sister who had died young, and the only remaining branch of Walt's family tree. The young man barely knew his uncle, but Walt wanted him to understand what had happened to the Granger bloodline and why the nightmares that had plagued the family for generations would finally end. Thomas emerged from the cabin, carrying a leather bag that contained the tools of their desperate trade. The sacred obsidian blade wrapped in blessed cloth, the stones for creating the medicine wheel, bundles of sage and sweetgrass for purification, and a collection of other ceremonial objects that had been passed down through his family for generations. "The moon will be completely dark by midnight," Thomas said, checking his watch against the position of the sun. "We need to be at the burial ground by 11 to allow time for the preparatory rituals." Walt folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope, placing it alongside similar messages he'd written to Dr. Maynard, Margaret at the Historical Society, and the ranch foreman who would need to handle the sale of his property if he didn't return. The act of writing his own potential obituaries had been strangely liberating, forcing him to confront the reality that death was always a possibility, but rarely a choice. "Thomas," Walt said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. What are my actual chances of surviving this ritual?" The Paiute elder was quiet for several long minutes, his weathered hands methodically checking each item in his ceremonial bag. In the old stories, when warriors went to face the spirits in their own domain, about 1 in 4 ever returned. But those were different circumstances, different spirits. And Kanuev has been imprisoned for centuries, growing more desperate and more powerful with each passing year. It won't give up Thomas willingly, and it certainly won't release its hold on your bloodline without a fight. Thomas met Walt's eyes with unflinching honesty. "I think your chances are better than 1 in 4, but not by much." Dr. Maynard had been loading supplies into his truck, but he stopped when he heard the exchange. "There has to be another way. Some alternative that doesn't require Walt to risk everything." "There is," Thomas said. "We could do nothing. Let Kanu Av continue growing stronger until it breaks free entirely. In another generation or two, it will have enough power to manifest physically without needing an anchor. When that happens, the disappearances will become massacres, and the massacres will become wholesale slaughter." The drive down the mountain took them through landscape that seemed increasingly hostile as they descended toward the desert floor. Trees appeared blighted despite the season, their leaves brown and brittle. Animals that should have been active during the day were nowhere to be seen, as if every living creature in the area had fled from some invisible threat. Walt's back had been aching constantly for the past 24 hours, the pain intensifying with each mile that brought them closer to the burial ground. The obsidian stone in Thomas's bag seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, creating a sympathetic resonance that left him nauseated and disoriented. They reached the edge of the desecrated burial ground just as the sun was setting behind the red rock formations. The side looked different in the evening light, more ominous, more aware. The shadows cast by the stone pillars seemed to move independently of the wind, and the silence was so complete, it felt oppressive. Thomas began the preparatory work immediately. using blessed water to cleanse the ritual space and burning sage to purify the air. The sweet smoke rose in spirals that defied the desert breeze, forming complex patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond human understanding. Walt, you need to understand exactly what will happen once the ceremony begins, Thomas said as he laid out the stones for the medicine wheel. When you enter the circle, Kanuev will sense the presence of Thomas's bloodline and attempt to claim you immediately. You must resist its influence while I complete the binding rituals. Walt watched the careful placement of each stone, noting how Thomas whispered a prayer over every piece before setting it in its designated position. The medicine wheel was larger than he'd expected, nearly 20 feet in diameter, with the stones arranged according to principles that connected the earthly plane with the spiritual realm. How will I know when Thomas is free? Walt asked. You'll know, Thomas replied with certainty. The spiritual bond between you will be severed, and you'll feel his presence departing. That's when the real danger begins, because Kanuev will try to prevent you from leaving the circle. It needs an anchor from your bloodline to maintain its connection to the physical world. Dr. Maynard had been setting up a small camp at the edge of the ritual site, preparing for what might be a long and difficult night. What can I do to help during the ceremony? Stay outside the protective barriers and keep the purification fires burning, Thomas instructed. If the rituals fail and Kanuev breaks free, you'll need to get as far away from here as possible and warn the authorities. Not that conventional weapons will do much good against the shadow entity. The people need to know what they're facing. As darkness fell across the desert, the supernatural phenomena that had been building for days reached a crescendo. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, sending visible breath misting from their mouths. Electronics began, failing one by one. First Dr. Maynard's truck radio, then Thomas's GPS device, finally Walt's digital watch. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of something large moving through the desert, something that didn't quite sound like it belonged to any earthly creature. Walt stripped off his shirt and handed his personal belongings. To Dr. Maynard his wallet, his championship belt buckle, and the sealed letters he'd written that morning. The desert air was cold against his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms and back. Samuel, he said, gripping the doctor's hand, thank you for everything. If I don't make it through this, make sure those letters get delivered. You're going to make it through this, Dr. Maynard replied firmly. You're too stubborn to let some ancient shadow get the better of you. Thomas had completed the medicine wheel and was now preparing the obsidian blade, wrapping its handle with leather strips and attaching sacred feathers that would help channel spiritual energy. The blade itself seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, creating a void in the darkness that hurt to look at directly. It's time, Thomas said, as the last sliver of moon disappeared behind the horizon. Walt, once you enter the circle, everything depends on your ability to maintain your spiritual connection to this world while resisting Kanuev's attempts to claim you. Remember, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for your ancestor, for everyone the shadow entity has killed over the past century, and for everyone it will kill if it breaks free. Walt stepped to the edge of the medicine wheel, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere, in the darkness beyond the stone formations, something was stirring, something that had been waiting over a century for this moment. As he prepared to cross the threshold into the sacred circle, Walt offered a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening, asking not for his own survival, but for the strength to free his ancestor from more than a century of torment. The desert wind died to absolute stillness, and in that silence, Walt could swear he heard the sound of his own name being called from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Walt stepped across the threshold of the medicine wheel, and the world changed around him instantly. The moment his bare feet touched the blessed earth within the circle of stones, reality seemed to fracture and reform. The desert night became a realm of shifting shadows and impossible geometries, where up and down held no meaning and time flowed in all directions at once. Thomas's voice reached him as if from across vast distances, chanting in the ancient Paiute language, while drums that existed only in the spiritual realm began beating with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. Dr. Maynard maintained the purification fires at the edge of the ritual site, his face illuminated by flames that burned without wood and cast shadows that moved independently of their source. The protective medicine wheel manifested as a circle of silver light around Walt, its barriers holding back waves of darkness that pressed against the boundary like ocean tide against a seawall. Within this sacred space, Walt felt simultaneously protected and exposed, shielded from the full fury of Kanuav, while serving as bait to draw the entity into the open. The shadow came for him almost immediately. It rose from the desert floor, like smoke-given substance, pouring through cracks in reality that opened at Walt's feet. The entity had no fixed form. Sometimes it appeared as a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes. Other times as a humanoid figure wrapped in darkness that seemed to devour light itself. But always, at its center, Walt could see two distinct presences locked in eternal combat. One was his ancestor Thomas, still recognizable after more than a century of imprisonment. The man's spiritual essence burned with the steady light of determination, fighting to contain the shadow, even as it slowly consumed him from within. Beside him, merged with the darkness, yet somehow separate, was Ezra Blackthorne, or what remained of him after decades of serving as Kanuav's primary host. Blackthorne's consciousness had been twisted beyond recognition, transformed into something that was neither human nor entirely inhuman. His spiritual form writhed with hunger and rage, desperate to complete the ritual that had been interrupted so long ago. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of frustrated ambition. "Finally," Blackthorne's shade whispered, the words echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The bloodline returns to fulfill its destiny. Your ancestor thought he could stop the inevitable, but he only delayed it. Now Kanuev will have its anchor, and the shadow will inherit the earth." Walt forced himself to remain standing as waves of psychic pressure crashed over him. The entity was testing the boundaries of the medicine wheel, probing for weaknesses in Thomas's spiritual defenses. Each assault sent spikes of agony through Walt's body, as if the obsidian stone was still embedded in his back and growing larger. With each passing moment, "Thomas!" Walt called out to his ancestor's spirit. "I'm here to take your place. You fought long enough." Thomas's essence turned toward him, and Walt saw eyes that reflected more than a century of unimaginable suffering. The man had been fighting a losing battle for generations, slowly being consumed by the very entity he was trying to contain. His spiritual form was fragmenting at the edges, pieces of his soul being absorbed by Kanuav with each passing moment. "Boy!" Thomas's voice reached Walt through the chaos. "You don't understand what you're offering. This thing doesn't just imprison, it devours. I've been dying by degrees for over 100 years, feeding it pieces of myself to keep it from breaking free entirely." Walt felt tears streaming down his face as he witnessed his ancestor's sacrifice. "Then let me carry that burden. You've done enough. You've saved more lives than anyone will ever know." But Kanuev had other plans. The shadow entity surged forward, testing the boundaries of the medicine wheel with tendrils of pure darkness. Where it touched the protective barriers, sparks of silver light erupted like fireworks, and Thomas's chanting grew more urgent. The spiritual battle was reaching its crescendo, and Walt could feel the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The anchor chain must be transferred voluntarily. Blackthorne's corrupted spirit laughed. But the young one lacks the spiritual strength of his ancestor. He'll be consumed within minutes, and then Kanuev will be free to claim this world as its hunting ground. Walt reached deep within himself, searching for the same strength that had allowed his ancestor to fight for over a century. He thought of Dr. Maynard's quiet dedication to healing, of Margaret's preservation of forgotten history, of Thomas Red Cloud's willingness to risk everything to maintain the spiritual balance of the desert. He thought of all the people who had died mysteriously over the decades, victims of an entity that fed on human suffering. The obsidian blade in Thomas's hands began to glow with spiritual fire as the medicine man completed the first phase of the ritual. The weapon would serve as a conduit for transferring the spiritual bonds that held Canoev in check, but the process required perfect timing and unwavering courage from all participants. "Walt," Thomas called out over the roar of supernatural wind, "when I give the signal, you must reach out and take hold of your ancestor's essence. The moment you make contact, Canoev will try to claim you both. Whatever happens, don't let go." Walt nodded, his muscles tensing as he prepared for the most important moment of his life. The moment Thomas raised the sacred obsidian blade above his head, Walt understood what he had to do. The weapon pulsed with spiritual energy that connected the physical world to the realm where his ancestor had been imprisoned for over a century. Without hesitation, Walt reached toward Thomas Granger's fading essence, extending his own spiritual energy across the void between them. The contact was like grasping a live electrical wire. Every nerve in Walt's body screamed as his consciousness merged with that of his ancestor, and for a terrifying instant, he experienced the full weight of Thomas's century-long imprisonment. He felt every moment of the endless battle, every piece of soul that had been sacrificed to keep Canoev contained, every scream of the innocent victims whose deaths had fed the shadow entity's growing power. "Take it," Thomas's spirit cried, pushing the burden of the anchor chain toward his descendant. "Before my strength fails completely." But Canoev fought back with the fury of a creature facing extinction. The shadow entity poured its full power into preventing the transfer, sending waves of spiritual poison through the connection between the two men. Walt felt his sense of self beginning to dissolve as the darkness invaded his consciousness, whispering promises of power and threats of eternal torment. Blackthorn's corrupted spirit laughed as Walt struggled against the entity's influence. "You see now, boy, your ancestor was strong forged by frontier hardship and righteous purpose. But you're soft, weakened by decades of comfortable living. You'll break within minutes, and Canoev will be stronger than ever." Walt wanted to deny it, but he could feel the truth in Blackthorn's words. Thomas had been a man shaped by the harsh realities of 1870s frontier life, someone who had faced death and hardship as daily companions. Walt, for all his rodeo toughness, had lived in an age of modern conveniences and safety nets. How could he hoped to match his ancestors' spiritual fortitude? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Walt's resolve began to waver, he felt the presence of everyone who had supported him in this moment. Dr. Maynard risking his reputation to help a patient, Margaret preserving forgotten history, Thomas Red Cloud sacrificing his own safety to maintain spiritual balance. Their strength flowed into him, reminding him that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about acting despite fear. "No," Walt said, his voice growing stronger as he embraced the spiritual connection. "Maybe I'm not as tough as Thomas was. Maybe I haven't faced the same hardships, but I've got something he didn't have. I've got help." Walt opened himself completely to the anchor chain, feeling its weight settle into his spiritual essence like a lead blanket. The moment the transfer was complete, Thomas's spirit began to rise from the shadow entity, freed at last from his century-long imprisonment. "Thank you," Thomas whispered as his essence prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited the spirits of the dead. "Take care of our bloodline, Walt. Make it count for something." Canoev shrieked with rage as it felt its primary anchors slipping away, but the entity had no choice but to accept Walt as Thomas's replacement. The spiritual laws that governed such exchanges were absolute. The shadow could not exist in the physical realm without a willing anchor from the Granger bloodline. But Thomas Red Cloud's ritual was far from complete. As Walt accepted the burden of containing Kanuav, the medicine man began the most dangerous phase of the ceremony, using the sacred obsidian blade to transform the cursed stones into tools of protection rather than imprisonment. "Walt," Thomas called out as he brought the blade down on the original obsidian stone, "you must willingly release your claim to the physical world. Let go of everything that ties you to this realm." Walt understood what was being asked of him. To complete the purification ritual, he had to surrender his attachment to life itself, trusting that the spiritual transformation would allow him to return rather than trap him forever in Kanuav's domain. The obsidian blade shattered the curse stone, and the pieces began to glow with purified light. Each fragment that had once bound the Granger bloodline to the shadow entity was transformed into a protective talisman. Reversing over a century of spiritual poison, Walt felt his connection to his physical body growing thin as the ritual reached its culmination. He could see Dr. Maynard at the edge of the medicine wheel, his face etched with concern as he watched his friend's body grow still within the sacred circle. He could hear Thomas's chanting growing more urgent as the ceremony balanced on the knife's edge. Between success and catastrophe, Kanuav made one final, desperate attempt to break free, pouring all of its accumulated power into a psychic assault that threatened to shatter Walt's mind. But the purified obsidian stones formed a new kind of prison, not one of imprisonment, but of transformation, changing the shadow entity from a creature of pure hunger into something that could be returned to its proper place in the natural order. "It's working," Thomas shouted over the supernatural wind. "The barriers are reforming. Kanuav is being drawn back into its prison." Walt felt himself being pulled in two directions, toward the depths where the shadow entity was retreating and toward the light where his ancestor's spirit was ascending. The choice of which path to follow would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or join Thomas in whatever realm awaited the departed. Walt chose life, as Kanuav was drawn back into its prison beneath the desert floor, and his ancestor's spirit ascended toward whatever peace awaited the dead. Walt made the conscious decision to return to his physical form. The purified obsidian stones formed a new spiritual framework around him, not binding him to the shadow entity, but protecting him from its influence while allowing the ancient prison to reform. He gasped back to consciousness within the medicine wheel as dawn was breaking. Over the red rock formations, Dr. Maynard was at his side immediately, checking his pulse and examining his eyes with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades treating the injured and dying. "Walt, can you hear me?" the doctor asked, his voice tight with concern that gradually gave way to relief. "I'm here," Walt whispered, his throat raw from hours of spiritual battle. "It's over, Samuel. Thomas is free, and that thing is back where it belongs." Thomas Red Cloud knelt beside them, exhaustion etched into every line of his weathered face. The medicine man had maintained the ritual for 6 hours, channeling spiritual energies that would have killed a less experienced practitioner. In his hands were the fragments of the original obsidian stone, now transformed into pieces of polished black glass that seemed to hold light rather than absorb it. "The curse is broken," Thomas confirmed. "Kanuav has been returned to its prison, and the spiritual barriers are stronger than they were before Blackthorn disrupted them. Your bloodline is free, Walt, and the entity won't be able to influence anyone again for many generations to come." Over the following weeks, as Walt recovered from his ordeal, the 3 men worked together to restore the desecrated burial ground to its proper state. Using the purified obsidian fragments as focal points, they rebuilt the sacred cairns that had once marked the graves of Thomas's ancestors. Each stone was placed with ceremony and respect, following traditions that predated European settlement by countless generations. Dr. Maynard found himself profoundly changed by the experience. His encounter with spiritual healing traditions that complemented rather than competed with Western medicine led him to postpone his retirement and begin studying the integration of traditional and modern healing practices. He established a small clinic on the reservation, working alongside Thomas to provide healthcare that addressed both the physical and spiritual needs of their patients. Margaret Whitfield was delighted to add the true story of the Blackthorn incidents to the Historical Society's archives. She worked with Thomas to document the Paiute oral traditions that had preserved the memory of Kanuev and the spiritual practices used to contain it. The resulting collection became a valuable resource for anthropologists and historians studying the intersection of Native American traditions and frontier history. Walt's physical recovery was remarkably swift, aided by the purified obsidian stones that Thomas had fashioned into protective amulets. The persistent pain that had troubled him for 20 years was completely gone, replaced by a sense of spiritual wholeness he had never experienced before. More importantly, the nightmares that had plagued the Granger bloodline for over a century ended completely. But the most significant change was in Walt's sense of purpose. The man who had drifted through retirement without direction now found himself serving as guardian of the restored burial ground. He moved his residence to a small cabin Thomas helped him build near the sacred site, dedicating his remaining years to protecting the spiritual barriers that kept Kanuev imprisoned. It was meaningful work that connected him to something larger than himself. Walt maintained the ceremonial fires that strengthened the prison's boundaries, learned the traditional songs and prayers that honored the site's spiritual significance, and served as a bridge between the Paiute community and the county authorities, who needed to understand the area's importance. The memorial stone cairn they erected at the center of the burial ground was inscribed with the names of all Kanuev's victims across the generations, from the settlers who had disappeared in 1874 to the mysterious deaths that had occurred in the decades since. At the top of the list, carved in letters filled with gold, was the name Thomas Granger, guardian and hero. On quiet evenings, Walt would sit beside the memorial and tell stories to the occasional visitors who came to learn about the site's history. He spoke of his ancestors' courage and sacrifice, of the importance of respecting spiritual traditions that were older than written history, and of the truth that some battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because they need to be fought. Walt's nephew eventually visited from Colorado, drawn by the letters his uncle had written on what he thought might be his final night. The young man arrived expecting to find a broken-down old cowboy, living in isolation, and instead discovered someone who had found peace and purpose in his later years. Their relationship, strained by years of distance and indifference, began to heal as Walt shared the true history of their family and the legacy of courage that ran in their blood. The desert around the restored burial ground flourished in ways that surprised even Thomas. Plants grew more abundantly, animals returned to areas they had avoided for decades, and the natural spring that had once been barely a seep now flowed with clear, sweet water. The spiritual healing that had taken place seemed to extend to the land itself, restoring a balance that had been disrupted for over a century. Walt lived for another 15 years in his role as guardian, long enough to see his nephew marry and have children of his own children who would grow up knowing the true story of their family's courage and sacrifice. When Walt finally passed away at the age of 83, he did so peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends who had become family and secure in the knowledge that he had made his life count for something important. Thomas Red Cloud spoke at Walt's funeral, telling the assembled mourners that some people live their entire lives without finding their true purpose, while others discover it in their final years and make up for lost time through the intensity of their dedication. Walt Granger, he said, had been one of the latter, a man who had spent most of his life chasing personal glory, but had found his greatest victory in serving something larger than himself. The sacred burial ground continues to be protected today, its spiritual barriers maintained by a combination of traditional Paiute practices and modern conservation efforts. The memorial stone cairn still stands at its center, a testament to the courage of ordinary people who chose to face extraordinary darkness so that others might live in the light.